everybody. This is Andrew with EVOQ, and we are here discussing the three-zone model. So you've probably heard about the three-zone model. It's gained a lot of popularity lately. Maybe you heard about it in a podcast or a blog post. It's commonly used when we are talking about polarized training, but it can be a little bit confusing. So us as cyclists, we are used to using the five-zone model, so the three-zone model can be a little bit confusing. So I just kind of wanted to make a video talking about what is the three-zone model, where do we get it from, and more importantly, how can you use it for your training? So um, I just wanted to dive into that a little bit. So right here, you can see that this is an illustration of the three-zone model. We have zone 1, zone 2, zone 3. And these are demarcated by the two different thresholds. So when people talk about, oh, I'm doing threshold intervals, well, that's a little bit misleading because there's actually more than one threshold. When they talk about doing threshold intervals, what they're talking about usually is this second threshold, so your lactate threshold or your second ventilatory threshold. And this would be right around where your FTP is. So when you're doing threshold intervals, quote unquote, that's typically where you're writing. But we also have this first threshold. Um, and if we want to compare this to the five zone model, zone 1 would basically be zone 1 and zone 2. So this would be like your recovery or your endurance zone. This zone 2 would mainly be zone 3. So this would be your tempo, your sweet spot. And then right around this second threshold would be your zone 4. And then basically this would be anything above your FTP. So zone 5, zone 6, where you do VO2 max or supra threshold efforts. So where do we actually get these two thresholds from? And what does it mean? Because this is from this three-zone model, this is actually where we get the five-zone model. So what is going on within our bodies that is giving us these zones? They're not arbitrary. They are actually based off of some things that are happening within our bodies. So what is changing to give us these zones? If we look here, I actually have some lab data that can help to better illustrate this. So this is some lab data from a VO2 max test that I did last year. So VO2 max test, if you've never done one, basically you go into a lab, you get on a ergometer, they put a mask on you, and you'll basically do a ramp test. So they start you at 50 watts, and basically you'll keep going harder and harder and harder until you can't go anymore. And so that's where all of this data actually comes from. And from this graph, we were able to identify that first threshold. So the first threshold would be sandwiched between my endurance zone and my tempo zone, if we're talking about cycling specifically. So you'll see here we have a graph, and on the bottom we have VO2. So that's basically the amount of oxygen I am consuming, the amount of oxygen I am using in my body that I'm extracting from the environment to produce power aerobically. And VCO2 is the amount of CO2 I am breathing out. So we all know this, that we use oxygen from the air, and then as a byproduct of that, we breathe out CO2. And you'll notice at the bottom, below the aerobic threshold, that's proportional. So that makes sense. I'm consuming oxygen and I'm breathing out a proportional amount of CO2. But right around this aerobic threshold, things kind of change a little bit. So you'll notice I actually start to breathe out more CO2 than I'm consuming oxygen. So why did that happen? Where is all of that extra CO2 coming from? So basically, the main thing that happens here is I begin to rely so much on my anaerobic system and I begin to consume more carbohydrates than I do fat. And as a result, lactate actually begins to appear in the blood at this point. So I think a lot of people think that it's not until you get to your FTP or your lactate threshold that lactate actually begins to appear in the blood. But actually, it's at this first threshold. But what happens is you have a safeguard, you have a buffering mechanism that can those prevent you from slowing down. So when lactate begins to accumulate in the blood, it dissociates and you have all these hydrogen ions circulating around. And that, when you're riding above your FTP, that's the burn that you feel. But to prevent that from happening, to prolong your ability to continue to exercise, basically you have a bunch of bicarbonate circulating around in your blood, and that will buffer the hydrogen ions. That will basically bond to the hydrogen ions, um, and prevent them from increasing the acidity in your muscle. But as that bicarbonate dissociates, it actually turns into CO2, and then you will breathe out that extra CO2. So the reason why I'm breathing out this extra CO2 essentially is because I am burning predominantly carbohydrates, and as a result, lactate is beginning to enter my bloodstream, and I am buffering it and breathing out more CO2. So that is how we find that point. How do we find the second threshold? Well, you notice here, this is one method that we can identify the second threshold. So another common way is you'll actually monitor lactate levels within the blood, but we did this by measuring oxygen consumption. So there's multiple different ways that you can find that second threshold. But here we have on the bottom, we have VCO2, so that's the amount of CO2 I am breathing out. And then we have VE, so that is my minute ventilation. So this is the amount of air that I am breathing in per minute. So basically, this is how deeply and how frequently I'm breathing. This is how heavy my breathing is. And as you can see, as the intensity increases, both of these things increase. I am breathing out more CO2 because I'm consuming more oxygen, and I am breathing more and more heavily. But you can notice here that right when we reach this second threshold, what would be pretty close to your FTP, this shoots up. So my breathing rate shoots up and I begin to hyperventilate. And basically, the reason this happens is because my buffering system, my bicarbonate buffering system, can't handle it anymore. There's too much lactate coming into the blood. The hydrogen ions are accumulating, and my buffering system can't handle it anymore. And so I'm approaching my second threshold. Say I'm doing a VO2 max interval. All those hydrogen ions, they start getting into my bloodstream. They're increasing the acidity of my muscles, and that's when I start feeling that burning sensation. And to try to get rid of all that extra acidity, basically you begin to hyperventilate. Your body's trying to breathe out all that CO2 and get rid of it. It's a futile attempt, but that is basically the response that your body has. So you probably noticed this, that you have, when you're riding at endurance zone and even tempo zone, your breathing is very linear. You know, the harder you go, the heavier you're going to breathe. But if you do a VO2 max interval or something like that, once you get above that FTP, you start to breathe really, really heavily, and you are approaching that maximum, right? So it's, and your body is trying to get rid of all those metabolic byproducts. But if you're riding just below the second threshold, your breathing's still pretty controlled. You might be breathing a little bit more heavily, but it's under control. So that is how we find that second threshold. So that is where those two come from. First threshold, second threshold. But now that we've gone through all the physiology, what does this actually mean for your training? Right? That's why we're all here. That's what we want to know. How can we use this to make ourselves faster? So back to the 3-zone model. So we talked about with the first threshold, how this is kind of where you transition to becoming predominantly carbohydrate burning. So below this point, you are using more fat than you are carbs. Once you cross over into this zone, you begin to burn predominantly carbohydrates. Above the second threshold, you're burning pretty much entirely carbohydrates. So why is it that we advocate for training in this zone one? And why is it that we say that it's not quite as good to train in zone two? Well, one of the reasons is because we can train our fat burning capabilities. So once we cross over into this zone, we begin to use more carbs than we do fat, and we're kind of defeating the purpose. So when we go out and do long endurance rides, one thing we want to do is train our body's ability to burn fat. As you probably know, you have essentially unlimited fat to use for energy on your body, but you have very, very limited glycogen stores. You have very, very limited carb stores that you need to preserve. Um, and so the more efficient you can get at utilizing fat as a fuel source, the more energy you're going to have for later on in the race when it matters most. So, it doesn't matter how good your FTP is or your 5 minute power is or your sprint is. If you get to the end of a 3 hour race and you're completely empty, doesn't really matter because you're going to be bonking. So that is one reason why we want to train within this zone, is to improve our fat burning capabilities. But the other thing is, we haven't really seen that there's any extra benefit to riding within this zone versus zone one. So this is just as effective for improving your aerobic fitness as zone two is. But yet you're going to be training your body's ability to burn fat as a fuel source, and it's much less taxing. So if you constantly train in this zone, you're not training your body's ability to burn fat, but it's also very taxing. And so as a result, you're kind of going to get a little bit stale. So we can get all the benefits we need from riding in this zone, and then some. So more than what we would see in zone two. Um, and then we have our lactate threshold here. This is where you would get into your VO2 max zone. So why is it better to train in zone three than it is to train in zone two? Well, as we talked about, this is the point where lactate actually begins to accumulate in your blood, and you can't handle it anymore. So when we train above this zone, we start to accumulate that lactate, and we are actually training our lactate tolerance, our ability to tolerate those high levels of lactate so we can keep going longer and longer. And then if we do over-unders and we build up lactate and then we drop just below, we are actually able to train that buffering system and our ability to clear lactate with our aerobic system. And if we can improve our ability to further clear lactate, that's actually going to increase this zone. So that lactate is going to accumulate in my blood later on, and it's going to push my zones up. So the thing with zone two is, it's kind of like the old saying, jack of all trades, master of none. So sure, we're building our base fitness, we're training hard, we're getting the reps in, but it's not better than zone one because it's too taxing. It's not going to help us build more fitness necessarily. And it's also not training our ability to burn fat. And it's also not really going to be better than zone three because we're just not going to be hard, and we're not going to be going hard enough to really push up our FTP and our lactate threshold. And then also, we're not going to be hitting these VO2 max, close to this VO2 max, which is also an important mechanism by which we would see aerobic adaptations. If we're looking at really effective interval sessions, workouts that accumulate a lot of lactate are actually really, really beneficial for inducing aerobic adaptations. There's an important signaling mechanism that when you accumulate lactate in your blood aerobically, that actually signals mitochondrial biogenesis. So it is an important precursor to aerobic adaptations. And we also see that training above 90% of VO2 max is also um, very important for inducing these aerobic adaptations. So when we train in zone one, we're really building that aerobic engine. We're building that durability, our endurance, and that is going to also help us to do these efforts because we're going to be able to generate more power aerobically. So we're not going to be relying as on our anaerobic system as quickly. The lactate's not going to appear in the blood as quickly. Um, and then add in a little bit of high intensity, start training in zone three. You're going to further train your ability to clear that lactate out and thus increase your zones.